she stood in her ironic My Little Pony nightie, swilling her flatmate's leg hair down the plug hole, Beth couldn't help feeling she wasn't exactly living life. As a teenager, Beth used to read about the 27 Club, that fabled club joined by wild celebrities who died aged 27, the existence of which implied that 27-year-olds spent every minute having crazy sex, driving speeding vehicles and living in a drug-fueled haze. Since turning 27 herself last March, Beth had actually spent every minute having no sex, driving a Ford Mondeo, which used to belong to her dad, and living in a crap flat share in Penge. Life doesn't always turn out how you expect. Later that morning, Beth was sitting at the tacky reception desk of the stupid hotel where she worked when an email pinged into her inbox. Beth was on it like a quiz show contestant on a buzzer. Any circular 20% off offer or phishing scam from someone pretending to be in Nigeria at least broke up the monotony of her long stretch till lunch. But this email was from a stranger called Greta. "Hello," began the email, admittedly fairly traditional opening. "I promise I'm not a nutter." Now the good stuff was kicking in. "And I hope you won't think this is weird, but check your bank account. I've put some money in it." Now, Beth knew exactly how much was in her account, minus £95, and the cash machine wouldn't let her withdraw a fiver. But when she checked her account now, she saw that, yes, somebody had paid in money, and bloody hell, it was £1,000. Another email. "Hope that's okay," Greta's email said. "And there's more where that came from. Promise it's nothing dodgy, but if you come to this address tonight, I can offer you Jaffa cakes and an explanation." Wow, this sort of thing never happened to Beth. Although she'd never actually wanted to join the 27 Club, she'd like to occasionally be close enough to give it a wide berth. And though Greta's invitation was possibly a slight risk, Beth reasoned it was unlikely to result in her choking on her own vomit. Also, Beth did like Jaffa cakes. If Beth was a long way from the Rock and Roll 27 Club, then Greta, it turned out, was peering at it through some kind of interplanetary telescope. Although with her sensible clothes, nervous manner and barely concealed unease at conversation, Greta was clearly nowhere near cool enough to own an interplanetary telescope, but did seem like she could have a good crack at making one. "Right! Beth! Ha! You're Beth!" said Greta awkwardly before asking her inside with the anxious nod of someone who literally never has people inside their house. Might be to do with that carpet, thought Beth, who'd watched 60-Minute Makeover, so knew a thing or two about interior design. But then Greta cut to the chase. "I've never had a boyfriend," Greta blurted. Possibly not a bolt from the blue, Beth thought. "But a while ago I got into online dating. I never thought I'd get anywhere until I met Brian. Brian's unbelievable. We just had this immediate connection. It's amazing." "Great," smiled Beth, who was going through a characteristic dry patch in her own love life. Brian's emails had become the most important thing in Greta's day. He lived in Ireland and was just like Greta. He worked in IT too and was equally reclusive, so it had never occurred to her this might happen. But this Monday, Brian had to be nearby for work and wanted to take Greta out for dinner. "The idea makes me feel sick," Greta said. "I've hardly been out since Mum died, and I've never been out with a man at all." "Okay," prompted Beth, still unsure what this had to do with her. "And there's something else," Greta said. "I was so nervous when I joined the website. I didn't use my own photo. Who'd go for someone like me?" "Oh, now," said Beth, as if Greta was a silly sausage. "So what I did," Greta confessed, not meeting Beth's eye, "was find a random photo online of someone I thought looked normal, approachable, confident, and I sort of used that. And the thing is, well, actually, here's the thing. I used a photo of you." "What the?" "I've lied to Brian. He thinks I look like you, and I just wanted to apologise, but also ask a favour. Would you go out with him?" So there it was. Beth had started to like Greta. She was sweet and vulnerable. Also, a good way of feeling better about your own inadequacies is to meet someone more inadequate than you. And let's face it was flattering that someone had chosen her photo, even if it was a frumpy, slightly awkward IT geek with no taste in interior design. "I know it's a bit weird," said Greta, "but it'd be so amazing if you'd help. It's only one night." "Yeah, one night of making small talk with some tech head called Brian. And I'll give you another £3,000? Well, look, it was only dinner. Greta was thrilled. And that weekend, while Greta got Beth fully up to speed on how to pretend to be her, Beth got all the details of just how lonely Greta's life was. She learnt about Greta's family, only child, parents both dead, her friends, the Tesco delivery man sometimes said hello to her, her house. She'd inherited it a decade ago but barely knew her neighbours. Greta described important events in her life. The time aged 15 when she collected a certificate in assembly and thought everyone was cheering, till she realised her skirt was tucked in her knickers. The 6 weeks she'd spent studying for her A-levels at her nan's house when she'd barely spoken to her, and then the night before her first exam, her nan had died. And her recent career success, designing databases from home, the technical details of which Beth couldn't swear to have understood, but sort of grasped the basics. Greta had thought of everything. She let Beth read all the emails between her and Brian, so she was up to speed on anything they might talk about. Seeing their tedious exchanges didn't make Beth look forward to Monday night with any more relish. The photo of Brian was pretty uninspiring too. Average looking and in need of a haircut. But Beth couldn't believe how seriously Greta was taking all this. She even set Beth up with a fake email account and credit cards so Brian wouldn't smell a rat. Monday arrived. Beth was there, early, sitting casually on a bar stool like something out of First Dates so she could get some drinks down her. Then suddenly, there was Brian. Beth watched him. Noticed, he'd had that haircut he needed. Waved and then went to lean casually back on the bar, misjudged the distance and fell off her stool, stumbling to the floor like some kind of less graceful Del Boy. "Stools!" she blurted as Brian helped her to her feet. "God, sorry, I mean, they're higher than you expect it, etc." Beth kicked herself for letting her first contact be yelling in his face the word stools. But if what passed between them wasn't actually a thunderbolt, it was certainly something involving electricity which Beth didn't know the name for. Greta would probably have known. But it was important to remember that tonight, Beth was Greta. Beth and Brian ate and drank and talked and laughed. Everything seemed better with Brian. They discussed that really funny time when Greta accidentally showed her knickers to the whole school and everyone had thought she was cute and a bit sexy. And they discussed that amazing 6 weeks Greta spent nursing her dying nan when the two of them had sung songs to each other, held hands, shared secrets, and ultimately grown as people. Brian was really interested in her. He was attentive, kind, and sexy in that way people sometimes are when they don't realise it. He was funny. He was loads better looking than in that photo. Oh, hang on. Irish. Beth was having to remind herself not to listen to his voice too closely. He was Greta's boyfriend, but Greta would be delighted with how well Beth was doing. "You've got beer froth on your nose," she laughed. "Oh yeah?" Brian smiled back, but in Irish. "You've got gravy on yours," and then gently stroked a bit of gravy onto her nose, exactly like someone fit would do in a film. Beth even managed to answer some of his boring work questions. She dredged up most of the technical things Greta had warned her might come up, the clients she was working with and stuff. She fudged it when he showed an interest in some of the finer details. They're pretty into it, those techie types, aren't they? But generally, Beth was getting away with it. And then at the end of the night, Brian dropped a bombshell. "So, here's the ting," he said, although in Irish. "Worth pointing that out again. I'm staying in town longer than I thought. Could I maybe take you out again tomorrow?" "Right, now what?" Beth got a taxi straight round to Greta's, who was desperate to hear how it went. "Yeah," said Beth. Yeah, it went well," and neglected to tell her about the laughing and the looking at each other and the way it felt standing so close to each other when they were putting their coats on in the doorway. Greta herself had had a terrible night. It was the first time in months she hadn't spent the whole evening messaging Brian. But when Beth explained the dilemma, they both knew there was no choice. Beth had to go again tomorrow. Nightmare. "I hope you two don't get on too well," Greta said with a half laugh. And Beth laughed too and said, "Course not," trying to ignore the fact that Greta looked like she might have tears in her eyes. Beth would never be the sort of woman who'd nick someone else's man. She'd never betray their sisterhood. "We've got nothing in common," Beth insisted. "When he was talking about technical stuff, I got lost." So Greta told her more details so she'd be convincing if it came up again. And the next night, Beth set off for her second date. Yeah, she did pop out in her lunch hour and buy a new top. But she needed a new top anyway. And it was important to take your commitment to the sisterhood seriously. The second date went well. A bit too well. Beth and Brian had quite a lot to drink, and they laughed and swapped stories, and Brian was so sweet when Beth told him about how her mum and dad's early deaths affected her 20s, that she almost forgot her parents were really alive and well living in Hemel Hempstead, and probably arguing about which of them forgot to take Bake Off. Brian said, "You know what, Greta?" in Irish. "Maybe we could go back to your place." And Beth remembered her grotty flat with the thin walls and irritating housemates and said no. And then remembered the real reason she should have been saying no, which was because she wasn't actually Greta. Oh yeah. Important to keep that clear in her head. Yeah, she did go to his hotel room, but they didn't have sex. It was sort of more romantic than that. They talked all night and they laughed and discussed their ambitions for the future. And when morning came, Brian said, "Greta, I didn't want to tell you before, but work are transferring me to up the road. I'm moving. We can properly be together." "No way," said Beth. "I wondered online, but now I really know," he said. "I'm falling for you, Greta," which was lovely for Beth to hear. But this was probably the time to remember she wasn't actually Greta. Greta was. And this whole thing she'd allowed to happen, this was actually going to ruin Greta's life. Yeah, so shit. As she left the hotel, Beth checked her phone. 26 missed calls from Greta. The thing is, she thought, as she brushed her teeth with her new toothbrush in the disabled toilet of McDonald's, Greta's got a well-paid job she likes and a house. She's beating me at life, actually. Maybe she could tell Greta Brian wasn't as nice as he seemed. That Greta was so great, she was too good for him. I mean, that was doing Greta a favour, wasn't it? That was virtually what someone knowledgeable would do, like a therapist or a big brother psychiatrist. Beth took a deep breath and knocked on Greta's door. Nobody answered. Weird. Instinctively, Beth tried the handle and went inside. Still don't like the carpet, she thought. But no sign of Greta. And then Beth spotted the envelope. It said Beth on it. Was it a lovely letter saying Greta quite understood and wanted Beth and Brian to be happy, and by the way, here was that £3,000 she owed her? Yeah, it wasn't actually. Greta had had an email from Brian. He thanked her for the amazing night and mentioned details of their future plans. He was desperate to see her again, and although he didn't know her address, if necessary, he'd walk the streets of her neighbourhood till he found her. Greta had panicked. Not only had Beth betrayed her, but she'd lost the only man she'd ever felt anything for, and she couldn't bear him seeing the real her, so there was no way out. Nobody would miss her. Life was pointless. So she'd ended it. Beth dropped the letter as she realised. This was Greta's suicide note. So that's... wow. Shit. Greta had actually killed herself. And it was Beth's fault. This was a bit like that time Beth had forgotten to feed her goldfish and it died, except this time with an actual person rather than a fish. Should she phone the police? But then they'd know it was her fault. This was really loads worse than that fish thing. Except actually, the thing about the goldfish was that people knew about it. Her dad had flushed it down the loo while her mum shouted at Beth about responsibilities. This thing with Greta was different. Literally, nobody knew. In fact, when Beth came to think about it, nobody really knew about Greta at all. No family, no friends, no colleagues, no contact with any neighbours. If she wasn't there anymore, it was really sad and everything, but nobody would really know. And actually, Greta had had a crap life anyway. This might not really be the end of the world. It certainly made things easier for Beth. Here Beth was, in Greta's massive house with all her stuff. She'd make the most of it. She could even do something about that carpet. Well, over time. Probably the best thing to do with Greta's note was to burn it and wash it down the sink. That way nobody could say this might have been her fault, like with that fish incident. And then a phone started ringing. Greta's mobile was on a shelf and it said, Brian calling. Shit. But mustn't attract suspicion, Beth thought, so she answered it. Brian! Were you thinking about me? In fact, Beth had been washing a suicide note down a sink, but now wasn't the time for that sort of chat. Maybe... Well, are you finally going to give me your address so I can bring you lunch? And although Beth hesitated, and although she knew she shouldn't be inviting Brian into the house of his dead girlfriend, she suddenly realised that what she wanted more than anything was to see Brian. And actually, she was pretending to be Greta. And here she was in Greta's house with no possible chance of the actual Greta turning up and spoiling things. Everything was always better when Brian was around. She gave him the address. When he arrived, lovely Brian, with flowers and some posh salads he'd bought from the deli on the corner, Beth had a moment's hesitation. So, Greta, are we mucking about or can I come in? And he smiled in an Irish way. Beth realised things might be okay. Yeah, you can come in, she said, and then we might start mucking about. I mean, Greta probably wouldn't even have liked these kind of salads, Beth thought as she tucked in. Greta was more of a sandwich girl. Beth felt calmer. Suddenly, today was about her and Brian, instead of about her having been really selfish and caused a suicide. So to be honest, that was loads better. Brian was particularly impressed with the computer stuff. He loved all that. And Beth found that was actually quite endearing. Maybe as their relationship progressed, she'd get into it all too, so they'd have stuff to share. Brian started fiddling with the computers and saying he couldn't believe he was actually here after all this time in Greta's house. Was it really her? Beth said, yeah, it was her. She was Greta, all right. And that's when Brian whipped out his police ID. Greta Holzenbeck, he said, you're under arrest for international cybercrime stretching back over the last 6 years. Bloody hell! And it really didn't seem like he was mucking about. Brian had spent months trying to gain entry into Greta's life, her home, her computer system, and now he had. Their relationship had been a scam. And as Brian ushered her into a police van, Beth realised pretty quickly that Greta had known exactly what she'd been doing. Greta had done everything to cover her tracks. That was her thing. She was thorough. In terms of ID, online, and under any kind of technical scrutiny, Beth effectively now was Greta. When it came to trial, Beth's mum and dad were baffled. They thought their daughter worked in a hotel she hated in Penge. They had no idea she was an international cybercriminal. But of course Greta would have a convincing cover story. Of course her parents would know nothing. They couldn't even get to the bottom of who'd forgotten to take Bake Off. Beth had known answers to all those technical questions Brian asked and given details of her clients and her crimes. And if she wasn't Greta, where was Greta? Yeah, Beth would say she committed suicide, but where was the proof? There wasn't even a note. 6 months later, when the prison guard told Beth she had a visitor, the last person in the world Beth expected to see was Greta. By that time, Beth was Greta. And yet here Greta was, with a suntan, a smile, and a packet of Jaffa cakes as a thank you. Nobody knew who the visitor was except Beth. She wanted to shout out, that's me! I mean, that's her! That's Greta Holzenbeck! But she realised absolutely nobody would believe her, and she knew this had always been Greta's plan. I needed someone dissatisfied, Greta explained. Turns out she was kind of German. At 27, the world should have been at your feet. But you'd settled, you were bored, unhappy at work, at home, in love, waiting for things to improve on their own, waiting for an email to change things for you. You could have done anything. You could have changed your own life. But someone like you, I knew you never would. So I did. What are you going to do now? Beth asked. Greta smiled. I'm going to live life, she said. I don't know whose yet. Maybe I'll live yours. And when she went, Greta left a card on the table. Beth opened it later in her cell. The card said, Happy 28th birthday.